going to do a 3x pitch biometric analysis of Robert Showtime Garcia. All right, here we go. So this is him coming in, light bullpen for the day. We're going to come out of leg lift. So I think right up front, look how you're curling your hips under, and you're pushing. You're shifting into your quad, and your knees even slightly turning in. But see how your pelvis is under there?
Yep.
That means you're just all sitting in your quads at this point. So you're loading right here. I want to load right there. Like I want to load more glute back, like sitting back.
Sitting on my shirt, right?
Yeah, like you're sitting, because you're kind of like shifting forward and hunched over. I want to like sit back and then really close off, and that's going to help you close off. Because if I look at like hip line, shoulder line, you can see you're not really separated yet. And that's because when you go in your quad, everything wants to open. That hip's going to want to open. And you can see that hip's actually slightly forward when you're supposed to be at that point actually starting to counter-rotate. So that would be flexing that hip. So you're going more here, not more here initially.
So it's like squatting down, right? Getting my butt down.
And forward. So as you move forward, flexing that hip. And then, like I said, that's going to give you a better stable position to turn, even close your shoulders more off as you go, like this. As opposed to like this, you're doing this, you go like this, and everything can close off more.
And that's probably having some knee issues, right?
Yeah, with your knee issues, it's just you reinforcing that unstable quad dominant position. Where, let's see if it keeps going. I don't know. It's not too bad. But you look at your hips. I mean, your hips are already starting to open. We don't want them opening till right before you drive. We want them to open. They're just right out of leg lift. They start to open very early. Okay, and then you could ideally, your leg drive is about right here. You could see you rarely really flex and load into your leg. So it's probably because of that. If I'm sitting in my quads, it's probably also linking to your front squat issues. If I'm flexing in my quad, I don't want to keep squatting down because I'm putting so much force into my knee. Right. That's why if I sit back, now I'm putting more of the force in my hips, and now I'm going to want to sit and keep loading and loading and loading into the ground to create more force. But that's something with me that you've been doing that for a long time. It's going to be very different for you to feel the opposite. So it's something you're just going to have to baby step. So you can see because of that, your front leg is really what's moving the fastest right now. So it's really kind of pulling you open, or it's generating a lot of the power. I like how you don't pull your glove side too hard with it. You still stay closed. But when you hit front foot strike, there's some separation between your hips and shoulders, but there's really not a lot hitting front foot. So if we look at how it's peaking, so basically when we look at these lines here, that's telling us positionally how separated we are. But when we look at these lines, it's going to tell us the timing of when things are speeding up and slowing down. And the red line right here is your hip. That's this hip rotating. And you can see probably right here is when your hip speeds are peaking. But also, that's when your trunk speeds are peaking. So we talked about that initially, how I normally see the hip speeds go off and then a big trunk. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing your hip and trunk just going together. Now, I told you because you got such a big upper body, you just need so much more power through that hip to probably throw off a big peak in your trunk, right? It's kind of like a whip. I grab the handle of the whip, and if it's all kind of just barely going together, I really got to put a pop in that handle for the meat of that whip to really move. And that's probably where you are. You just got to, that's why getting your load down and your drive down is going to be huge, because that's going to put more force through the trunk and get that pop
like
to your
in
trunk.
these lines, you see that I'm not generating power at all, right?
Not much, right? Because see your hip and trunk are like right on stacked on top of each other. You would want to normally see your hip do this, and then out here, after your hip do that, you'd want to see your trunk coming all the way up here. But they're both going together, and then your arm's going off. This is all your arm. And the speeds get too fast for the sensors at this point, so that's why it's erratic. But this is all clumped up. You want to separate the green and the red, and you want to go hip, and then a big trunk. And like we looked at, you actually did that better in a linear sequence. So that's a rotational sequence. You did that better in a linear sequence here, because at the point your trunk's peaking, see how when you landed, you pushed your trunk forward. So you kind of forced your trunk to get a little bit more through it. So it's kind of like you threw the handle on the whip really easy, and then you kind of push the trunk, the body through to get the trunk going, right? Ideally, I would like to see that come off in rotation and in the linear movement because of your leg and trunk and hip power.
And that's one of the main things I noticed, like through my career, that I told you, like I don't lean my trunk forward. You know, I'm
stay
like
straight up.
Stay straight up.
Because probably you've always loaded in your quad, hips went early, not a lot of power through your hip, and this kind of came around with not a lot of power, and then you've tried to force things at the end. That's where you've picked up your velocity and you're a big guy. So if we can do it better, we're going to load into the hip. We're going to counter rotate more now because we're in a more stable hip position. And then we're going to generate more power through the hip in separation, and that's going to generate more power through the trunk, and your V-load is going to be up. And also, too, when you don't separate your hip and trunk well, and then you force your trunk forward, it throws your arm behind your back. That's a little too dramatic, but it'll throw your arm behind your back, and it creates what we call arm drag or hyperangulation. It's hard on your arm because it's not a good sequence. A good sequence would be a powerful hip, then that launch a powerful trunk, and then what happens is when you do that, you have more time before your trunk comes around, and then your arm syncs up with your trunk better, and then everything moves really clean at the end. But I think with you, and then also too, your front leg drives. Like right here, your front leg could be driving. It could be pushing back. So that's why I'm excited with you, because you're barely driving, you're barely separating, and then you're barely extending your front leg. So it's like velocity, velocity, velocity. Like we improve those. These are big jumps in velocity.
So those are the main three key components that you look when you analyze biomechanics for big jumps in velocity, right?
Yeah,
and those are. It's curious you say that, because those are the three things I knew, like in my past. Like I didn't know. I knew I wasn't using, at all, but I didn't knew how to fix it. But now that I came here and you explain all the science, all the biomechanics, now we know that a lot of these issues are mobility issues and strength issues, Yeah. Some things that I need to work during these 3 months, and especially like this about the front leg. Like I knew, like always, I never like have this,
a drive.
Yeah, that stop the energy that you generate from behind. Like I never generate energy here, not separation, and then I never stop that little energy, generate. I know I feel a little behind, but at the same time I'm excited because, like you say, like there's so many room to improve, that I'm
look at
excited,
it this way, like what's the hardest you've ever thrown in your career?
The hardest 93. And
okay, so
once.
Right, so 93 is your hardest. And if you were, even at that time, when you were moving better, if you were able to better do these three key things, you would have been 97, 98 at your size. Because I'm sure you've played with guys your size, or maybe even smaller, that throwing way harder than you. It's because they're doing these things even better. So it's like, let's get in there and let's build all these things in, and let's see how high your velocity goes.
Sounds good, perfect, and I'm excited. Stay tuned. Showtime, Top Velocity, the road to success.
The road to the show.
The road to the show.